Hello, this is Ars the Apologist, and going to give a slideshow presentation on something I decided to do called a Christian's Curious Inquiry into the Quran. Now, this all started after really, getting serious into studying Quranic manuscripts and Quranic textual criticism and Quranic studies in general. And then as well as engaging in the endeavor to read the Quran from cover to cover. So, utilizing that, I have been looking into the Quran, especially trying to compare and analyze it in terms of the Bible with the same kind of questions we should be asking ourselves. So my curious inquiry, or my curious questioning into the Quran, was then as a result beginning at that point. And not just that, but I had more questions that I engaged in and new discoveries that I found in light of the Islamic literature. So, that being said, let's dive straight into the presentation, shall we? So, what prompted this curiosity? That's the question. Well, it'll be studying the Old Testament in Islam, which I begin to notice similarities, especially when you look at the Arabic language with the Old Testament Hebrew and Aramaic language. And the similarities in their particular words. Like one of the examples that's easy to point out is where the Hebrew is shalom for peace. You have a same one in the Arabic, which is salam. And hence why you even hear the two sound alike whenever you have the greeting from the Hebrews and and those who speak Arabic. One in the Hebrew says shalom aleichem, whereas the Arabic says salam alaikum. So there's similarities in the language that I start to notice, and I think as well in theology, which I believe gets to the next point, is that besides language and the usage of certain prophets, because they make references to Moses, they make references to Jesus, they make references to all these other different figures, there was some historical positions on theology that were affirmed at the same time. That's not going to necessarily be covered in this video, but hopefully we'll get there in due time. But that being said, I decided to stick with the studies of the Quran, since most Muslims I encountered would claim that the Bible has textual variants and is therefore unreliable because of the variants that are in the Bible. I took a great problem with that and thought, that I did know that there was Quranic variants, but the more I looked into it, it was a much deeper issue than I could have thought, to the point that if I were to ever become a Muslim, I would like to have spent years of studying to just even address one simple question in a more academic fashion. And there was also the benefit of the doubt, by allowing the possibility for Islam to be true as a result of this research and inquiry. Because when you look into something, you might grant the opportunity that you're going to find answers that will satisfy you and ultimately lead you to believing, okay, that this is true. But at the moment, that wasn't the case during the search. In fact, while trying to be on that path to see if Islam was true, the path was getting further away from that possibility. So, as I mentioned, it led me to a deeper and more complicated understanding of the religion as well as the book that it is following. So, something to preface before we begin, because I can already tell some people are going to be commenting or trolling in the comment section. I want to just leave this as a little tool here. I am by no means claiming to be a scholar. I am not claiming the Quran is not the word of God here. I don't think this removes anything for Muslims. And I am merely pointing out questions I have and what I feel is going to certainly keep me away from Islam for the time being, for the most part. And I am, however, going to contend that this does shed some doubt on the textual transmission process and the reliability of the text of the Quran. Besides textual variants, the Quran contains other issues historically. But that being said, we're mostly focusing on issues in terms of the inquiry and the research of the Quran. So that being said, with regards to what we have here, we are going to make this noted. I'm going to keep the preface up here so that way people can look and check to know that this is our intention. We aren't trying to do this with ill harm, but just simply laying out what I have covered and come across. So what exactly is the Quran? We have to make note of this for the viewers that are Christian or anything else that may not necessarily understand what the Quran is in light of how Islam teaches and defines it. According to Muslims, it is the word of God and therefore important. So obviously that's something to keep in mind. According to Ahmed van Denver, a German Muslim scholar who wrote a book called Usul al-Quran, in the book, he says, the Quran contains the revelations of Allah, the creator and sustainer of the universe, to mankind. It is the message from God to man, and therefore of utmost importance to us. So he gives a more simple definition. A more complex one with a lot of interesting claims going to me, and on top of it comes from YASIR Qadi, from his book Introduction to the Sciences of the Quran. And in this, he says, the Quran is the Arabic speech, kalam, of Allah, which he revealed to Muhammad in wording and meaning, and which has been preserved. And I'm just going to note this, if you see brackets instead of the other form, that's me inserting that there for some people. So, has been preserved in the MUSHAFS, which is manuscripts, and has reached us by mutawatir, successive transmissions. It is a challenge to mankind to produce something similar to it. So he provides the fact that it's the speech of Allah, meaning it is his direct words, and he reveals this to Muhammad in wording and meaning, and which has been preserved in the Mus'hafs, meaning the different manuscripts. It has reached to us by transmissions, meaning referring to an oral transmission, and is a challenge to mankind to produce something similar to it. So in other words, one of the things you'll hear from the Quran is, to prove this is the word of God, provide a verse that is similar to these Quran verses, or provide a chapter or a surah that is similar to that what you find in the Quran. They claim that you can't fit or match that criteria. So, that being said, let's go ahead and tackle that. YASIR Qadi's claim. Is it true? In light of my research, we discovered that the different manuscripts of the Quran do in fact contain variants in the Arabic text. We also have to consider the fact that even among the companions of Muhammad himself, there were variants on how a certain text should be read in Arabic that weren't just boiled down to different QIRAT readings, though there will be people that will try to say and justify that that is indeed QIRAT reading, but of course there's also debate on that. Like, some people will say it is a QIRAT reading, and some say no, it's not a QIRAT reading, we don't know. Some will even go as far as to say some of these people were misguided in going with that particular reading. But again, it depends on who you talk to. The Quran has also gone through a difference in perfect preservation arguments. Some say that it was perfectly preserved in the written manuscripts, and therefore the whole written text has never had any sort of deviation, and it's been perfectly preserved that way. Others then say it has been perfectly preserved orally, saying, well, we don't need those manuscripts because it's not perfectly preserved there. It's perfectly preserved in the oral tradition. But however, there will be some that say both. So again, it depends on your Muslim. And while we can say the Quran is indeed preserved, we can't say it was perfectly preserved in light of the evidence in Quranic studies. Now, keep in mind that the issue is the claim about preservation and then perfect preservation. For example, we believe that the Bible is perfectly preserved, or we believe that the Bible is preserved. But in terms of perfect preservation, we can't necessarily make that claim in light of the fact of what we have in textual criticism, that there are some issues that are still being debated about. While we could say that we even have the preservation of debatable verses, we can at least realized that we would be coming close soon to trying to formulate a perfect preservation argument versus what is in the Quran in light of what we're about to show you, or what I'm about to show you, sorry. Now, the written transmission. Let's cover that for a second. The only form of the written transmission during the time of Muhammad was in the form of memory aids that was written on fragments, since there was a plan for it to be an oral book. Yet it was also argued to be later on written book. So in other words, that at some point it was to become a written book. In Al-Azami, page 67, it says, though revealed verbally, the Quran consistently referred to itself as kitab, book, as something written, indicating that it must be placed into written form. So that comes from Al-Azami's History of the Quran text. And this right here comes from the same book, page 69. Based on the total number of scribes and the Prophet's custom of summoning them to record all new verses, we can safely assume that in his own lifetime, the entire Quran was available in written form. Now, that doesn't mean that it was compiled into book form at the time. It just says that the entire Quranic passages were available in written form. Now, let's go to the focus on the written transmission in light of the Caliph and companion of Muhammad, Abu Bakr. Because after his death, after Muhammad's death, the Quran would soon be compiled into a complete book form on order of the Caliph named Abu Bakr. And as I mentioned, he's one of Muhammad's companions. And so, in a source entitled Ibn Hajar, Fathul Bari, which I believe I got from Al-Azami, I forget where exactly this had come from, but Ibn Hajar, Fathul Bari, says the Prophet was taken from this life while the Quran had not yet been gathered into a book. So this is a narrative that is used to point out that the Quran had not yet been gathered into a complete book format yet. While they still had the Quran, they didn't compile it into a book. And so after his death, there's that whole thing. And then according to Sahih Bukhari, 4986, tons of memorizers of the Quran were killed at the Battle of Yamama. Soon, Zayd bin Thabit, another companion, was given the task to help compile the Quran along with Umar. So these are two other different companions, and they are given the task to collect the verses of the Quran and to compile them into the book format we know today. So the book that we have is due to the work that is done from Abu Bakr, Zayd bin Thabit, and Umar. But so they gathered the verses of the Quran to create the first compiled Quran in book format. Now this one's going to be a complicated one, because this is where we really start to get a little shifty with the Quran and the textual history, is that when we start to get to Caliph Uthman. Now, while there is reports of the 7 aruf, better known as the 7 ways to recite a word or a text, this wasn't able to be sufficient for some people in the Muslim world. So that being said, if you read in Sahih Bukhari 4987, records of the time when the Muslims of Sham and Iraq were waging war, and Hudayfa, one of the Muslims, was, quote, afraid of their differences in recitation, which people point out is the aruf. So they're afraid of the differences in recitation. What's striking even more is that he says, Uthman, O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the book, meaning the Quran, as Jews and the Christians did before. And is in reference about how the Jews and the Christians did about their scriptures, referring to some textual variants that we can find in history, and then the different views on that in the different camps. So point being that there are people differing about the meaning and the recitation of the Quran. And as a result, people are, waging wars about this, and this one Muslim is worried about this, and like, save the nation before they differ about the book. So, in light of these, apparently the Aruf, or then later on the QIRAT, weren't sufficient enough. And he saw these differences similar to variants in the Bible. Thus, that's why Uthman said, "Send us the manuscripts of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials into perfect copies and return the manuscripts to you." So, to fix the problem, they were going to need to gather all the different manuscripts so they could compile it into perfect copies and then return the manuscripts to you. But what exactly was done? Well, if we read in the next part of the story, this is what we read. In the same hadith, it says, "In case you disagree with Zayd bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, write it in the dialect of Quraysh." The Quran was revealed in their tongue. They did so, and when they had written many copies, Uthman returned the original manuscripts to Hafsa. Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what they had copied, and ordered that all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burned. So, there was order that there was going to be this perfect one standard text, and then afterwards the other materials were to be burnt. So he basically doesn't want anyone else knowing about these variants or these different manuscripts and the fragments or the whole copies, and he therefore wants them burnt. Now, there's the debate then about, we have these manuscripts that probably survive that, but again, as I mentioned, it's debatable as to whether or not that these would be those actual cases. So, after this perfect transmission, the fragment manuscripts, or whom manuscripts, were ordered to be burnt so that there existed no variation. So, they were ordered to be burnt, and so that way there would be no variation. So we should expect that this solves the problem, correct? Well, we soon discovered the old manuscripts of the Quran. This is one of the examples of people looking at quote-unquote Uthman Quran manuscripts. So we started doing research and coming across older manuscripts of the Quran. And so that leads to the critical studies of the MUSHAFS. So whenever we find what were manuscripts during the time of Uthman, we examine them to discover that they actually weren't from the time of Uthman, as some people want to claim, but instead later copies after the revision. And this is from Ekmeldin Ishangulu. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. Is a Turkey scholar of Islam. So he's from Turkey. Al-Mushaf al-Sharif, attributed to Uthman bin Affan, page 35, says, "One of the most important questions of Quranic history is the whereabouts of the Mushafs attributed to Caliph Uthman, and whether any of them reach the present day. Unfortunately, we do not have a positive answer to this question." So even examining those manuscripts of the attributed Uthman manuscripts, these scholars that are trying to put their work into this to make this particular piece, they don't have an answer positively to the question. And examples of the Quran manuscripts that can be dated after Uthman and are claimed to be of Uthman by some people is the Topkapi manuscript, the Samarkand manuscript, the Sa'ana Palimpsest, and Istanbul manuscripts. So you have these particular ones I have by name to bring out. And variations existed in the manuscripts of the Quran as well. For example, Tayyar al-Tukulik, who worked also in the same book, page 41, says there are deviations from grammatical rules and spelling mistakes in the Mushafs attributed to Caliph Uthman. These are, if you don't have grammatical deviation rules or spelling mistakes in your modern Arabic Qurans, but this one did, that would by definition be considered a textual variant. Hence why I just want to point out that textual variant is a very broad term. But we'll also find some significant changes and variants in them as well. As we see here from Keith Thompson in his article, The Corruption of the Quran, Evidence and New Research, he mentions and points out, in quoting Al-Tukulik's work in pages 87 to 89, mentioned one of the variants among the supposed Uthmanic manuscripts listed in Al-Tukulik's al-Musaf al-Sharif, is that while Quran 3:158 in the modern edition reads, if you should die or be slain before him, you shall undoubtedly be gathered. The Great Paris manuscript reads, if you should die or be slain, you shall not be gathered, due to an extra Arabic letter changing the entire meaning of the text. So right there we have the fact that there is the die or be slain before him, you shall undoubtedly be gathered, and then another one says, you shall not be gathered. So those are textual variants in terms of the different manuscripts. So even more, we will dive deeper into the variants in the Sa'ana palimpsest. And so what is the Sa'ana palimpsest? Well, as two scholars who studied this note, the Sa'ana palimpsest, quote, is a palimpsest, that is, a manuscript of which the text, lower writing, was erased by scraping or washing and then written over. Recycling parchment in this manner was not uncommon. It was done, for example, for an estimated 4.5% of manuscripts from the Latin West produced from AD 400 to AD 800. From Siddiqui and Gherdazi in their thing on Sa'ana 1, I believe is the article, Sa'ana 1 and the Origins of the Quran. So this is an important thing you can find. You just Google or Bing search that and be able to get the PDF. So yeah, we have that, and that's why we can use then UV lighting to read the lower text to see what was written on there before it got erased. And as is noted in page 9, the manuscript tells us many things, as the manuscript may be, from a textual critical standpoint, the most important one among those discovered in 1972. And does it contain variants? Absolutely. In fact, if you go to Surah 2, Ayah 196, it reads, for example, in the text of the standard version, which says, do not shave your heads until the offering reaches its destination. And then the fact that the earlier text lacks the word ru usakum, it says, do not shave until the offering reaches its destination. So you have a textual variant there where one says, do not shave your heads. The next one just says, do not shave. And then in another one of Surah 2, 196, says, if any of you be sick. Or then the other says, should one of you be sick. Now, these aren't affecting meaning, much like in what we saw in the earlier one, but this does contain, indeed, a variant, since one has fein, kana, hadun, or ahadun. And keep in mind, I'm just simply reading what's going on here. The earlier text has fein, kana, ahadun, instead of fahman, kana. So, there is indeed a textual variation there. In this one, fasting or alms or an offering, it is then missing a word in the earlier text, missing what would be the alms. So then you have a variance in these other different ones, like in Surah 63, Ayah 7 at the bottom. It says, where it says that the earlier one has min halihi after yanfadu. So the standard text says, they are the ones who say, do not spend on those who are with the messenger of God in order that they may disperse. The other one says, do not spend on those who are with the messenger of God in order that they may disperse from around him. So this one has a extra phrase after it in the earlier text, but then in the later one that is considered the standardized one, that's when you start having from around him removed. So what is one of the most significant finds? Well, there's a missing verse. In page 23 of the paper by Siddiqui and Gherdazi, we read another exception concerns verse 85 of Surah 9, which is missing. At 16 words, this omission is found to be an outlier when compared to the size of other missing elements in C1, referring to the earlier lower text, which are much shorter. So while we can't say we are never able to figure this issue out, we cannot say that no textual variant ever popped up in the manuscript tradition, because, well, textual variants have popped up, and this being one of those key ones. And there indeed existed variants, especially as what we have demonstrated here. Another one to point out is Surah 2, Ayah 222, and the Fox Palimpsest. Got this from the book from James White. But here is an example of the Fox Palimpsest reading versus the modern one. I should have tried to make note of which one is which, but you can just tell by yourself from looking at where the arrows are pointing in comparison to that particular Arabic word. The ones that go up and down are showing a difference in the Arabic. And then if you look at the other one, you'll see where it's going across from each other to form that X. That's where words are being replaced. So in other words, the particular, I'm going to use the mouse here for a second just to point it out. This particular Arabic word with the 4 dots and then this little shape here is now going to be over here once we go down here. So what would be here is now over there. And then what would be over here with the 3 dots and then this thing with the E, now it's where this letter should have been. So we see definitely a textual variation on a good scale just based off of this. And then some are trying to suggest that the Sa'ana palimpsest has a third different reading, but I don't think anyone has really looked into it or made too much of a survey on that to discover that. But someone has mentioned that that's possible based off of some observations. Which then leads to the Islamic scholars affirm the textual variants existing, such as what we read in Keith E. Small's Textual Criticism in Quran Manuscripts, because this is mostly a modern claim of the perfect preservation thing. But according to Keith Small, says, in contemporary popular Islamic discourse, it is an assertion often stated as established fact that the text of the Quran has been preserved perfectly since it was given to Muhammad. To the contrary, early and medieval Islamic scholarship was quite free in its recognition of textual variation and missing portions of the Quran, and did not tend to make claims of perfect transmission. Also, study of the ancient Quranic manuscripts confirmed the flexibility described in the earlier ages of Islamic scholarship. So page 6 of Textual Criticism and Quran Manuscripts, where we have this particular thing going on here, and that indeed early Islamic scholars were allowed to have differences in opinion on certain matters. It didn't mean they didn't think that the Quran was not the word of God. They just believed that it wasn't perfectly preserved, but that it was just preserved. Now, oral transmission. Some of the more recent arguments made lately have been that the Quran has been preserved through oral transmission, but not the written one. However, this has been called into question lately, especially in light of recent scholarship and Quranic studies on the subject. Variant readings, are important to us here because they prove that there was no oral tradition stemming directly from the Prophet strong enough to overcome all the uncertainties inherent in the writing system. James A. Bellamy in Some Proposed Emendations to the Text of the Quran. And then another one from Devin J. Stewart found in the book called The Quran and Its Historical Context. Says, the tradition of Quranic recitation can be shown to ignore or run roughshod over many discernible or retrievable features of the text, particularly with regard to rhyme that must represent the oldest stage of its performance. In addition, while many of the variants recognized as legitimate within Islamic tradition may plausibly have arisen through oral transmission, many others cannot be being based on graphic and not phonic resemblance. So Devin J. Stewart's essay that comments on that. Now, ultimately, in light of this knowledge, we just have to say this. But it's from Devin J. Stewart again, that the common argument that an uninterrupted and completely reliable oral transmission has miraculously preserved the text of the Quran from such error falls flat. So this argument falls flat, and here's why. So the emendations in the Quran from the narratives. So as the two scholars I quoted earlier, they're very good scholars in this particular field of study, and one of them, actually just both of them in their essays, note and record what several scholars in their Arabic works have recorded about the variants that were even found in the minds of Muhammad's companions during his time. A classic example comes from that of Ibn Abbas. And according to James A. Bellamy, he says that Ibn Abbas, cousin of the Prophet, and a famous early commentator, is credited with detecting and correcting several errors in the text. In Surah 13, Ayah 31, we find Afalam Yayasi Ladina Amanu, which means, have not those who believed despaired. Ibn Abbas, following Ibn Masud, read Yatabayan, have they not seen clearly, and said that the copyist, I think he might be talking about me here, said that the copyist must have been sleepy when he wrote Yayas. The scribe who wrote Yayas was probably not sleepy but confused by similar consonantal outlines. The word Yayas and Yatabayan are so different that much a mistake could not have occurred in the oral tradition, so we have to look to the written tradition for an explanation. And indeed, this makes sense if you're focusing on it from a written perspective, but in terms of an oral tradition, there's no way you can mess that up in terms of pronunciation. You have to realize that's a completely different word altogether. So, there we go. We have to look at the written text for an explanation, according to James Bellamy. Now, other issues include the Arabic QIRAT. Now, as you can look right here, what we're talking about is different versions of the Arabic Quran. So you have the Warsh and the Qalun, you have Al-Duri, you have Khalaf, you have the Hafs. Now, let's explain what this means here. Now, if you read on the left of the chart, it's basically referring to the reader, meaning that this stems from a certain particular reader. So you have Nafi, you have Ibn Kathir, you have Abu Amr al-Ala, Ibn Amir, and you have these different transmitters that are basically from their students, that then they have a reading after them. So you have the Warsh Quran, since the guy that is named Warsh was a student of Nafi, and so then come from Qalun. And then those two Arabic Qurans from their readings. Warsh is in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, West Africa, Sudan, while Qalun, you can find that Arabic text in Libya, Tunisia, and parts of Qatar. So, the one we're familiar with is the Hafs one, which, as it says, is from the Muslim world in general, and it says it comes from Abu Bakr Asim. Yeah, and then there's also the one from Ibn Ayyash, which doesn't have a mention, because we're going to get into the QIRAT in a bit. According to page 186 of the book on Sciences of the Quran, YASIR Qadhi says that the QIRAT are particular methodologies of reciting the Quran. They are named after the Qaris who recited the Quran in that particular manner, and they were famous as being the leaders in this field. They represent various ways that the companions learned the Quran from the Prophet. They differ from each other in various words, pronunciations, and rules of recitation, tajweed. They are not the same as the 7 aruf. So you have to keep that in mind. That's not the same as the 7 different aruf. But according to YASIR Qadhi, he says these differences are only in the various words, pronunciations, and the rules of recitation. He doesn't say anything about the meaning or anything like that. While there are several different QIRAT that exist today, there are scholarly conditions as to what constitutes the QIRAT. However, because there is no set QIRAT conditions, this could easily allow for more than just an established 10 authentic QIRAT. Because as YASIR Qadhi notes in page 191, theoretically it is possible for there to still exist other authentic QIRAT besides these 10, the 10 that are approved today as canon for us, since there is no divine law regulating that there can only be 10 QIRAT. And he is true. There is not a hadith or anywhere that says there can only therefore be 10 based on the standards. Same thing with the issue of the aruf. While some of the Muslims try to ignorantly dismiss these different versions of the Quran as differences in merely pronunciation, and that there are no different words or meanings in these texts, we have found this not to be the case from them. I will now play a clip from a guy whose name is Dr. SHEZAD SALEEM, who is a scholar who is not trying to refute the Quran, but rather to try and merely teach some things that he discovered upon examining it critically to help defend it. So, pay attention to what he is saying in the video, and here comes the video. I will begin it now.
The differences in these versions is not just in matters of pronunciation or or accent, but it also relates to differences in verb patterns, differences in nouns, different in a singular or plural noun, and similarly in declensions or Arab. And then there are differences in particles also. For example, at places we'll have waw or a fa in a difference of opinion. And just to give you an example, that the differences which are found in these various versions. So, for example, if I categorize these differences, although these categories which I have made are not exhaustive, but some of the categories which can give you some idea of these differences is that in one version we find the words, as you can see being displayed on your screen, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ, and in the other version we'll find فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ. So we find the word huwa is missing in one of them. Similarly, there is this difference in singular and plural nouns. So the first of these verses which I cited was Surah Hadid's 24th verse, and now I will cite Surah Tahrim's 12th verse. And the words of this verse in one of the versions is وَصَدَّقَتْ بِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّهَا وَكُتُبِهِ وَكَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتِينَ. And the words in another version are وَصَدَّقَتْ بِكَلِمَاتِ رَبِّهَا وَكِتَابِهِ. In the previous we had the plural kutub, and now we have kitab. وَكِتَابِهِ وَكَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتِينَ. And then we have also the differences in verb patterns. For example, in one verse of Surah Araf, which is verse 141, the words are is anjaynakum min ali fir'auna yasumunakum su'al azab yuqattiluna abna'akum. And in other version the words are yaqtuluna abna'akum. And then again we have a difference in declensions or the Arab. And in Surah Lahab, the 4th verse reads in most versions as hammalat al-hatab fi jidiha hablum min masad. Why some versions say hammalatul hatab, so it is declined in the nominative, while the first one is declined in the accusative. So all in all, we can see that there is a difference in these areas. And if you ask me that does this difference change the meaning of the Quran as well, I will say yes. In many cases, it does change the meaning. And although the change might be very minor and it might not be of much significance, but again, it does change the meaning. And in some cases, there is a drastic change in meaning as well. For example, in the tayammum or in the wuzu verse of Surah Maida, which is the 6th verse of Surah Maida, if it is read in a particular way during ablution, we would not need to wash our feet. To wipe them would be sufficient. To do masa on them would be sufficient. So if we read the verse as arjulakum ilal ka'bayn, the way it is found in some of the versions, then we'll have to wash our feet. But if we read it as arjulakum, then we would not need to wash our feet. Merely wiping them or doing masa on them would be sufficient if we are doing wuzu. So you can see that there is a difference in the directives as well.
And so, yes, he was referring to Surah 5, Ayah 6 there for that last particular one. But yeah, that's from Dr. SHEZAD SALEEM. But here's another thing I noted from him. He mentioned something I think a lot of the Muslims are going to need to make kind of public information, especially for those in the West. Rather it be in terms of making it for an English version of it so that people like us can read and see where the differences are, and then also if possible make these two things absolutely free online, whether it be in the English or the Arabic, for us to access. But here is another thing he points out.
And may I show you viewers that if I show you this Quran before me and I open up any page of the Quran, you'll find on its sides that the other variant readings of a particular verse which is mentioned in the main text are mentioned in the margins, and you can see that there's hardly a page in this whole corpus of the Quran which is devoid of any variation in this reading. And this variation in reading, again, as I said, is basically acceptable to all our scholars.
So it is acceptable for these readings, And as a result, because they acknowledge this and accept that, they're going to make books and publishing material off of this. But that's the thing. I think we honestly need material like this available and open for the public, and not just simply limited to the scholars, so that way we can examine these things. Now, there's another variant reading to focus on, and that is from Surah 7, Ayah 57, the QIRAT variant of BUSHRAN or NUSHRAN. This one I gathered from a book called Which Quran by an article from Ibn Warraq. And in it, we have this. Now, to focus on the text and what it means, I'm going to go ahead and just simply cite to you Surah 7, Ayah 57 in the English, and I'm going to be using a translation you'll be hearing a bit in this, which is the Majid Fakri one. We have, it is he who sends forth the winds bearing the good news of his mercy. So right here we have, that's where we see this text is going to be used, as the winds bearing good news of his mercy. Now, noticing that what kind of Quran this is, and it's going to be utilizing the left most likely on this Arabic thing here, that would be the Hafs text, that would be Bushran. So we have Bushran that is being used there. Now if I'm going to take a look to make sure and double check that that's indeed the Arabic here, yep. So it is indeed using Bushran in my Arabic text in the bilingual translation. You will see that that's where it is translated usually as good tidings or good news. If we were to go with the reading from Warsh, though, the Arabic text is meaning NUSHRAN, to spread out and diffuse. And I did in fact correlate this with a friend who had access to read Lane's Arabic lexicon of these Quranic passages, and these Quranic words, and indeed they defined it just like you're seeing on the screen. It says that Bushran means good tidings and good news, and Nushran just means to spread out and diffuse. So if we were to read it in the Warsh translation, we would read something like, it is he who sends forth the winds bearing diffusion, or to diffuse, of his mercy. Or some people would say it is he who sends forth the so you have all these different things that would be as a result here of the text. So that being kept in mind, let's go to IMRAN MANSUR, otherwise known on the internet as Dawah Man, on the variant reading in Surah 33 Ayah 6. And we're going to get more into this in a bit, but listen to what he says here, that is acknowledged by some scholars about a reading of the Quran that is with one of the companions of Muhammad.
There's a recitation from some of the Sahaba, such as Ubay ibn Ka'ab and Abdullah ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, where at the end of that part of the ayah, النبي أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم وأزواجه أمهاتهم وهو أب لهم. Where Allah Azza wa Jal said in that recitation that the Prophet ﷺ is closer to you than your own self, and his wives are our mothers. And he, Muhammad ﷺ, huwa abun lahum, he is their father. He is like a father to them. Not our literal father, but Allah Azza wa Jal said in another part of the Quran that the Prophet ﷺ is not a father of any one of us. Rather, he is the messenger of Allah. But he has a status of a father. Now this qira'ah is not recited anymore, but there is a hadith which backs it up with a similar meaning, where the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said in the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, he said, إِنَّمَا أَنَا لَكُمْ بِمَنْزِلَةِ الْوَالِدِ. He said, I am to you the station of a father. I'm like a father to you. I'm like a dad to you. I'm a father figure to you. All of us.
So he mentions the variant reading, which adds that he is a father to these people, and this is also then noted in Yusuf Ali's Quran translation in the footnotes in Surah 33, where it has the sentence that reads, the Prophet is closer to the believers than their own selves, and his wives are like their mothers. But then Yusuf Ali, in his footnote on this, mentions the following in regard to a QIRAT of one of the companions of Muhammad. In some QIRAs, like that of Ubay ibn Ka'b, occur also the words, and he is a father of them. So Imran Mansur said that he is like a father, but according to the Qur'an or the Qur'an of Ubay ibn Ka'b by Yusuf Ali in his translation of Render in the Arabic of that particular Qur'an note, he is a father, not like a father, but he is a father of them. But however, he comments and says that this implies his spiritual relationship and connection with the words, and his wives are their mothers. So right here we see in Yusuf Ali's text that, there's still an application to be applied here with regards to the text. So this would even be a significant variant involving the regards to extra words in Quranic verses and different QIRAT. So other issues include the forgotten verses. Allow us to go to the Quran to understand one of its claims that we can observe and at the same time cannot observe, which is Surah 2, Ayah 106. Whichever verse we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring instead a better or similar one. Do you not know that Allah has the power over all things? So Allah causes abrogation of verses at times where we aren't under verses that come before the latest revealed verses if a contradiction is revealed. This is the meaning of abrogation. One example is the permission of alcohol, and then eventually Surah 5, Ayah 93 was revealed condemning alcohol consumption. So at one point it was okay to drink it, now it's not okay. However, you would be surprised to learn about the different verses mentioned that are said to now be forgotten and no longer in the Quran. One of these, according to Sahih Muslim 1050, we used to recite a surah which resembled in length and severity to Surah Barat, which is the ninth surah of the Quran, and I have, however, forgotten it with the exception of this, which I remember out of it. If there were two valleys full of riches for the son of Adam, he would long for a third valley, and nothing would fill the stomach of the son of Adam but dust. So if you were to pick up your Quran today, you try to find that particular verse that's just cited there, you won't find it. It's no longer in there because it says he remembered there was a surah that was at the same length and severity as Surah 9. So if we're talking about length, we're talking then by going to Surah 9, or Surah Al-Taba, or Surah Barat, depending on the different name, because it has multiple names. It has 129 verses. So in other words, there is a surah that is forgotten that contained 129 verses, and one of those 129 verses was this last sentence in the hadith that is on screen. So right here we see an entire surah of the Quran has been forgotten. An entire chapter has been forgotten. And we can easily tell, since the example gives it of a verse that you won't find in the Quran. So if these are gone, how can we truly tell if, as the test goes, a better or similar one is brought forth if we don't even have the earlier verses that are now forgotten, of which we can apply this test and test to see if this is indeed true? But not only that, what about these other forgotten verses? That's right, my friends, there are more forgotten verses. Aisha said Surah Al-Ahzab used to be recited in the time of the Prophet with 200 verses, but when Uthman wrote out the codices, he was unable to produce more of it than there is today. That is 73 verses. We have 73 verses today, but back then it was recited with 200 verses. So Surah Al-Ahzab had 200 verses. And by the way, just a quick note, Aisha is the child bride of Muhammad. Abu Ubaid wrote this whole narrative here in his book, Kitab Fadail al-Quran. And in the same source, we read an interesting comment from Ibn Umar, where it says, "Let none of you say, I have learned the whole of the Quran, for how does he know what the whole of it is when much of it has disappeared? Let him rather say, I have learned what remains thereof." So we can certainly say we have some of the Quran. We can't say we have all of it, though. We have missing verses. We have like all this going on where it used to be 200 and now we're reduced to 73. So that's at least 100 missing verses right there. So it's time for the conclusions and the questions. So what are my questions in this conclusion? Well, number one, whenever it comes to the Quran and the preservation in the eternal tablet with Allah, as stated in Surah 85, ayah 21 to 22, and before we continue it up with this question, let's just go ahead and read Surah 85, ayah 21 to 22 in the Majid Fakhri Quran. Yet it is a glorious Quran in a well-preserved tablet. And the tafsir literature and the commentators and the scholars point out what is meant by this is a tablet that is in heaven with Allah, that He ordered there to be written on, and He had this with Him for eternity. And He has the Quran written on there. So if the Quran and the preservation of it is in the eternal tablet, the question is, do we have all of what is fully on the preserved Quran? And I should have put this, if yes, how do you know? If not, then isn't that a problem? Then the next one is, can the Quran still be the word of God even if it has multiple variants in its text? This is just a genuine curious question. If the early Muslims were going to memorize the Quran and let that be it, that's how it's going to be, why is it that they disagreed on certain readings to the point that it had different meanings or additions to the text? Since the QIRAT differs from each other, which one is closer to being identical to what you read in the eternal tablet that is recorded about in Surah 85, ayah 21 to 22? With regards to the science of textual criticism, how much of the original text can we get? Meaning the text is the original first ever text, the first original. How much of that can we get? Utilizing the sciences of textual criticism and the history of the Quran, would you allow the same kind of standard to therefore be held to the entire Bible? So in other words, what needs to be done with the Quran on textual criticism, or in analyzing the history of the transmission or the history of this text, would you allow that same exact kind of standard and treatment to be used for the Bible, and not just limit it to the Quran? And if the Quran was shown to not be perfectly preserved and contain textual variants, would this prove Islam to be false according to you? Because this is something I've been definitely curious about with some people who will literally take this and say, well, therefore Islam is false. I want to know from some of those people, though. These people that we have that may not have engaged in the conversation, if the Quran was shown to not be perfectly preserved and contain textual variants, would this prove Islam to be false according to you? If not, then why? And if it is, I would like to also know why. And says, these are just the few questions I had, and others would also have, because I'm sure they do. But anyways, that is all that we have on the presentation. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I hope that this information helps you out, and just that you be a better witness to Muslims, and that you have a good day. Overall, just have yourself a good day. See you around, and God bless.